Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Simone Brand. I think I know most of you from the Energy Division Resource Adequacy Group. Today, we're going to talk about the slice of day load forecast and showing template. We are recording the presentation today. The slides and recording will be posted on our resource adequacy history website. And as always, please be safe, note your surroundings, and be comfortable. So all of the attendees have been muted. I actually disabled the regular chat, so please, if you would like to type a question, enter it in the Q&A function, or raise your hand and I'll unmute you if you'd like to ask your question out loud. And do remember to mute yourself again once you've finished asking your question. Quick background on RA reform. We've been working on it for a few years now. Back in July of 2021, we adopted the slice of day concept and 6 principles for determining how to proceed with RA reform, and that established a process and timeline for developing the final restructuring proposal that would be based on PG&E's original slice of day proposal. Then last year in decision 220650, we adopted SCE's proposed 24-hour approach to the slice of day framework. And the decision directed additional working groups and a working group report to address implementation details. And then earlier this year in April, we issued a decision adopting RA reform implementation details, including on compliance tools, RA accounting rules, test year details, and coordination with the CAISO processes. So now since then, we've been working towards implementation of the 2024 test year. So we're here today primarily to talk about the LSE compliance templates that we just put out. We've also put out several drafts of the master resource database. You should expect to see another draft soon. And thank you to all of you who've submitted feedback on the originals. Been waiting for the 2024 NQC list to be finalized before putting out another version of the MRD that will be based on 2024 values. We've also been working on the PRM calibration. All of this ahead of the 2024 year-ahead filings. The slice of day test year filings will be due November 30th, and then month ahead filings for the test year will be due by the first day of the month for March, June, and September. However, for LSEs that will be showing storage in MCC bucket 4 and their compliance showings, they will be required to submit the slice of day template along with their compliance filings on the compliance due dates. We'll also be soliciting your feedback as we prepare the assessment report after the year ahead test showings, which will be due. The report is due on February 1st or by February 1st, and there will be an opportunity for stakeholders to provide formal comments on the report in the new RA proceeding, which should be opened in the next month or two. All right, so today we'll be getting first a quick update on the hourly load forecast from Lynn Marshall, and then most of the time will be devoted to discussing the slice of day showing tool. So just give me 1 second and go to Lynn.
Okay. So good afternoon. So you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So we're just wrapping up the analysis and revision development of the month ahead forecasts and the hourly forecast for 2024 using the final set of load forecasts from LSEs. And so I wanted to give parties a little overview of how that process went and kind of a preview of what results look like. So when the LSEs get their forecasts, I'll kind of understand what's driving those changes. So we did this in 2 stages. Was first to use the existing monthly peak forecast development process, and then develop the hourly forecast. So just to recap briefly, for the monthly peak, we're getting forecasts from each LSE and then using a variety of historic data, DASR data, determining a benchmark, weather normalized peaks, et cetera, for comparison, and compiling historic load factor, coincidence factors, and applying these LSE specific adjustments, applying a coincidence adjustment to come up with a set of LSE coincident peaks. There's some demand side credits in there. And then the final step is applying a prorate adjustment to get within 1% of the service area forecast. So after we do that, go to the next slide. We have from step 1, we've determined the monthly peak and a monthly coincident and non-coincident peaks and the associated energy use with that. And then we're constructing hourly coincidence factors that reflect differences between the LSE's non-coincident peak day and the system peak days. We're using those inputs into kind of a curve stretching formula that fits the load shape that the LSE submitted to our target adjusted monthly peaks and energy, right? And then there's a calibration step to make sure that the hourly forecasts are consistent with step C from the monthly process. And then again, we're applying some load side credits. And I would note in the preliminary forecast, we didn't include, there's some utility-owned storage in the non-summer months in the Edison TAC area. That didn't show up in your preliminary forecast, but it will be included in the revised set that you'll get soon. And then again, pro rata at the hourly level for each TAC area to the CEC forecast. So we can go to the next slide. So how does that all work out? And I have just a couple of examples here to talk about. I think I missed one. Go back one. There we go. Okay, let's talk about SCE first. Okay, so this is just by way of illustration. So this is the SCE TAC area. It's the LSE forecast for June. And I'll go through the different lines on there. The purple scatter plots are just for comparison purposes. Those are actual system peak days in summer 2022 for the TAC as a whole. So those include non-jurisdictional loads, but just you can see the overall load profile is similar to both, to first what the LSE submitted, which is the dashed red line. That's the aggregate of the submitted jurisdictional forecasts. And then we're going to do some adjustments to that. And in this particular case, we're adjusting some LSEs up to get their peak where we evaluate it should be, and then applying coincident adjustments. So you have the green line is slightly lower during the peak period. And then to get to the CEC forecast, we were applying the pro rata, and that's the blue line. So in this particular month, you can see the pro ratas are pretty small during the peak period. The blue and the green dashed line are pretty close together. We do have a fairly large pro rata in the morning hours, right? The CEC, the IPER forecast generally has higher morning loads, and this is a typical pattern in the summer months. There's we have a higher loads in the morning, and then we have a longer peak in the evening. So if you look at our 2021, again, there's fairly high pro rata in that month. So that seems pretty straightforward, and that's kind of the pattern overall in the summer months. Now let's go to the next slide. And we're going to look at January 2024, it's a different situation. So you notice on this one, the low profile of the submitted forecast, the red dashed line, it's pretty more similar into shape in the actual EMS loads, those purple scatter plots. Whereas the CEC forecast, that blue line, has a much larger dip in the middle. And so what's driving this? CEC we're including in our forecast an assumption of more behind the meter PV generation than in the forecast we're getting from LSEs. So in adjusting the forecast, I found using, as part of the coincidence adjustment process for those LSEs with PV generation, their coincident factors from days with a similar or closer load shape to the CEC forecast will essentially lower their forecast in the midday somewhat and sort of allocate that impacts of that PV to those LSEs. In this case, so these are pretty small prorata adjustments in the midday, something like 1%, 5%, 6%. There's some other winter months where that midday prorata, as things stand right now, and we're still finishing this, are more like 10% or even larger sometimes. And one of the things to understand about this is the way CEC is currently modeling behind the meter PV in our hourly load forecast is we're using an average PV profile based on historic data. That's not necessarily always going to be well correlated with PV production on the system peak day. So for example, there's a lot of cloud cover on the winter peak day. We're going to be overestimating PV production. So that's a methodological improvement we've been aware of, and we have a lot of improvements in the works right now that'll get implemented in the next couple of years. And we talked about this at our August 18th IPA workshop. So along with things like enhancing our modeling of climate change, revising our historic data sources for PV generation. We'll also look at other methodologies for modeling PV generation. So the adjustments that we're making to LSE forecasts now, that could change in the future depending on the CEC load shape. We don't know, it's not likely all of those changes will be made in time for this IPA cycle, maybe not until 2024, which would be like the following RA compliance year. So just something to be aware of. Our load shape could change, and that will flow through to the adjustments we make to LSE forecasts. Okay, so that's all I wanted to share, just to give people some context for what their forecast will look like. Simone, you could go to the next slide. Next slide. So we hope to wrap up in middle of this month, and we'll send out individual reports that have the monthly peak and the hourly, sort of showing the major steps in the hourly forecast adjustment, along with the month ahead forecast template, that since there is still one opportunity to revise forecast for load migration in Q1 2024, you'll still need those for month ahead forecast tracking. And when the complete forecast is, then I'll post a more detailed set of aggregate results on the RA compliance page. And as always, if you have questions about your individual LSE forecasts, we're always happy to talk. So reach out to CEC staff. And that's all, and I'll answer any questions.
Any questions for Lynn? You can either type your question or raise your hand. Okay, so we got a question from Scott Olson, who wants to confirm that ESPs will have different hourly shapes than IOUs and CCAs due to the 100% CNI load.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things and it is a little challenging because of the issues I just talked about, but I am starting with the ESP, each LSE's own load shape, and trying to sort of, and using each LSE's own historic hourly coincidence patterns, which means ESP mostly shouldn't have much of a duck shape. So we're trying to allocate that sort of PV to the LSEs that have a lot of behind the meter PV. There is in some months maybe a little more larger pro rata adjustments than we would like, but with, you know, I still have to operate within the constraint of the existing CEC load shape. So that's kind of the only factor, but part of what we're doing in the coincidence adjustment process is trying to mitigate the sort of unintended, inappropriate adjustments to individual LSE shapes.
Don't see any other questions. Oh wait, one more. On these charts, can you clarify what these
Okay, so that's
shapes are?
That's just for kind of providing context, in particular for January. I'm not using that directly. I just wanted to show the load shape, because here what you can see in January is we didn't see the CEC forecast has more of a midday dip than what you really see in the EMS load, just for, this is 1 year, it's a snapshot. And the LSEs are submitting forecasts with that same pattern. So given those considerations, that's what's driving towards this like negative pro rata. So that's not an input into the RA forecast specifically. No, okay, and I see there's a question about utility owned storage. Okay, that was a very, okay, for Molly had to follow up on the EMS, those TAC area loads of purple triangles, that includes non-jurisdictional loads that's TAC area, right? So it's should be about 10% higher than the jurisdictional loads, right? So this is just to compare the shape, right? You shouldn't, not the magnitude. Okay. All right. So the utility owned storage is actually, it's a special situation that the PUC deemed during the summer emergencies a couple of years ago that Edison could procure some front of the meter utility owned storage, and it goes in the summer months, it goes into the what's the right word? The bonus reserve margin. I'm not using the right term there. But in the non-summer months, LSEs in the SE TAC area get a load side credit, and you got that last year. I think it started maybe in the fall, one of them, and you'll get it in the non-summer months. There's about 200 a month through May, and then 425 in November and December that gets prorated out. So that was a special emergency situation that the PUC decided.
I think that's all.
Okay.
Thanks, Lynn.
All right. So, bye.
Should I take over, Simon?
Go ahead.
Great. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Robert Hansen. I'm a senior utilities engineer in Energy Division. I built the template that we'll be discussing for the rest of this meeting or workshop. So let's dive into it. Oops. Okay. So we're going to go over some presentation objectives for this presentation. And we're going to look at the template design. We're going to prepare a showing. So go through the process of developing a showing and then reviewing it to verify that it's a valid showing according to the validation rules built into the template. And then we're going to do a demonstration of that process. Then we're at the end going to look at the project timeline with upcoming dates regarding the template and the slice of day resource adequacy showing process. And then any last questions. And throughout, if questions come up, you can type them into the chat box, and I'll try to answer them at the end of each section of the presentation. For the demonstration, I'll try to address them more in real time. So the objectives of this presentation are to help familiarize all of you with the design of the template and also how to use it to input a valid slice of day showing for resource adequacy purposes. And in order to do that, to show how users can review the validation tests and at the end go over user questions. So the template, these are kind of our objectives when we went into the process of developing this template. We wanted it to be able to communicate requirements and resource information about the available resources to the load serving entities, as well as to communicate from the load serving entities their resource adequacy showings back to CPUC. We wanted to iterate upon the existing filing processes and forms and integrate with the new slice of day framework. We wanted the template to incorporate some built-in validation checks to help users develop their showings, as well as include some useful charts to help visually verify the showings. And we also wanted to build in functionality to accommodate both single and multi-cycle storage resources. So with that in mind, we went into designing the template. So because of the added complexity of the 24 slice of day hours that make this template a bit more complex than previous filing templates, we decided to use tables and queries as opposed to the default Excel paradigm of cells and ranges. Tables in particular provide more structured data, provide a more rigorous structure for data than cells and ranges, which makes it easier to automate processes both for the LSEs who might be automating their inputs, and on our end, we want to be able to automate extracting the data out of submitted showings. One thing to note about tables is that they automatically resize to accommodate new data. So when you're inputting them, we'll look at how to make sure that's happening correctly. And then beyond tables, queries implemented in Excel's Power Query make table-wise transformations and calculations a little easier and more clear than doing the same processes with cell-based formulas. Just for an example, on the left side, you see a range of cells in an Excel worksheet. On the right side, we see a table implemented also in an Excel worksheet. And we can see on the bottom how a particular column of those worksheets can be referenced within Excel. So in an Excel formula on the left side, it's if you want to sum a column, you just take the sum of the addresses. On the right side, you can use the same sum formula, but reference the name of the table and the name of the column, which makes the formula a little bit longer, but also a little bit more readable for people. And this gets it more valuable when the formulas are much more complicated. In order to access the queries, Excel has a built-in Power Query editor. So if you click on a query or its output, which is another table in a worksheet, you can access the Power Query editor. It'll pop up on top of Excel and show a query. I find this interface a bit nice to use. You see on the right side, it has this list of applied steps, which you can click through and see transformations on tables as they occur and kind of verify and understand how the calculations are performed. Just another quick comparison of a Power Query calculation versus a cell formula. These are equivalent calculations implemented in both paradigms. What I wanted to highlight here was how in the Power Query, the references to specific cells within a worksheet are much more concise and tidy and I think readable. So my hope is that it's easier to follow the calculations if you need to look into that. In terms of workbook organization, once you open the showing, you'll notice there are quite a few worksheets in different sections with color coding to indicate the different sections. There are 3 sections we want to highlight on this slide regarding data that's built into the workbook or that needs to be input into the workbook. So these all represent worksheets with the sources of truth used throughout the workbook. On the top bullet in this slide, you see blue color-coded worksheets. These are the inputs that the load-serving entities will use to input their showing, listing their resources and their resources capabilities. Next, we have a single orange tab that includes the requirements and allocations that when an LSE receives their workbook will include just their requirements and allocations in a single table. And then finally, on the third bullet, we have a set of green color-coded worksheets that include descriptions of resources and resource capabilities divided into a few different tables. This is really a kind of a clone or a stale copy of the resource master database that's also available separately. And it's pared down specifically for use in this workbook. There are also a couple more informative sets of worksheets. These don't contain critical data, but they show the data in various ways that hopefully are useful to the user. So on the first bullet, we have gold colored or yellow colored worksheets that include a dashboard showing a battery of validation tests that the workbook performs. And second, we have in that section, we also have the complete showing that combines all the data that an LSE inputs in their blue colored worksheets with resource data. That LSE showing complete tab will actually be the data that CPUC extracts from the workbook once we receive it for a showing to verify compliance. And the second bullet, we have charts that are available to help users review their showings or the requirements that they need to meet. Among the data containing worksheets, most worksheets contain a single table. You'll see that when we look at some of them during the demonstration. This will hopefully make it easier to find and input relevant data and information, with a couple exceptions. The certification table or the certification worksheet doesn't contain a table. Instead, it's just input in a format that should be familiar to users who have worked with the existing filing template, for example. We also have a profile optimization worksheet that actually contains 3 tables that are required for setting up an optimization problem for Excel's solver. One thing to note is in most use cases, the LSEs need only edit the blue tabs, so they don't need to do anything with the orange or the green tabs. Those should be ready with current information when the LSEs receive the workbook. But you're also free to adjust things in those. Just be aware that when we receive the showing that we'll be verifying against our copy of the data. And the remaining tabs showing informative displays of the data are updated automatically, so no data needs to be entered into them either. For accessing the queries, Excel, if you have Excel open, there should be a data tab and there should be a button labeled queries and connections. By clicking on that, you'll be able to open a sidebar that shows in this workbook all of the queries that have been built into the workbook. And then you can open the Power Query editor to inspect those queries just by double clicking on any of the queries listed. The Power Query editor kind of allows for the implementation of a relational database within a single workbook. So all the data is self-contained in the workbook, but it has tables and queries that are able to reference and perform calculations against one another. And you're able to visualize the connections between each of them inside the Power Query editor. One thing to note while you're working through the workbook is that queries will be running automatically based on a few different triggering events. For instance, clicking on certain worksheets will cause a VBA script to start a background query refresh. You'll know when a query is refreshing if you look at the bottom left of the Excel window. This little status bar kind of indicates that a query is going or running in the background. So while that's happening, just be aware that the data in front of you may be about to change as soon as that query completes. At this point, are there any questions?
We have one question from John Newton. Will the CPUC provide a fully editable version of the LSE showing tool so they can audit the calculation workbook logic?
Yes, I believe the version that we already sent is fully editable, unless I'm mistaken. And yeah, great. And the intent is that we will be sending each LSE their own copy of the workbook with their own requirements and allocations. So they'll have that version as well. Anything else? If not, I can move on. Oh, I see another question.
Yep. When will the LSEs receive their workbooks?
Simone, do you have a timeline for when this will go into effect?
I don't have an exact date, but it should be quite soon. Jamie, do you?
Yeah, I think Lynn just gave a timeline on when she plans on wrapping up the year ahead load forecast, which largely drives all the allocations. So as soon as we get that file from the CEC, we'll be able to calculate, all the necessary load ratios and CAM, DR, all the allocations that go into the requirements. So I think Lynn had said mid-September, so that's what we're shooting for, is shortly after mid-September to get them out to everybody.
I see another question, what LSE specifics will be included in the LSE files? So I think we can hold on that question until we get into a later section of the presentation or in the demonstration, and we should cover that. And I think we can move on to the next section. So now we're going to look at how to prepare a showing. And the design of the template was with the intention that users could move from left to right along the tabs. So start from the leftmost tab, which is actually a README tab with some general instructions, and then move on to the next tab, which is a certification form, which just contains information about the load serving entity and the individuals submitting or certifying the showing. One thing to note is that these rows 5 and 6 may be removed in future versions, but it's important to list all of this information as complete as possible when submitting showing. Particularly the load serving entity needs to match what's in the requirements and allocations tab. Otherwise, some of the table calculations will not join correctly. Also, the showing month listed here is used for some of the validation and for getting the current requirements, allocations, and QCs for resources. So moving on from the certification tab, the next tab within the blue group is called the LSE showing worksheet. And this is where LSEs should list all the resources that they will be showing for the showing month indicated on the certification tab. So this is really just a list of resources and their overall system capabilities. So we ask for a contract ID. Oops. A contract ID, a resource sub ID, and then an NQC or VER under contract. We wanted to note that this field might be confusing. It just means the Pmax or the VER for solar or wind. I hope I'm getting this right. Or the amount of generation capacity under contract for the resource listed. And then also local and flexible RA showings. And then information about the contract start and end dates, SCID or counterparty, and then MCC bucket 4. We'll get into this a little bit later, but that applies strictly to storage resources. And it's only going to be used for this upcoming test year for the slice of day framework. The MCC bucket 4 has a special test applied that we'll look at when we look at the validation tests. That is kind of a subset of an overall test applied to storage regarding how they are charged from excess capacity. Column K is for unspecified imports. We'll go into how to use that field. But basically, that should usually be false unless the resource is an import and isn't listed in the resource database. And then the final column is just indicate whether you want to use the default profile, which can be a variable profile for instance, wind or solar resources, or a fixed profile for certain other resources. Let's see. I think we covered that. Yeah, so the next tab in the blue group is called Resource Custom Profiles. So that last tab on the LSE showing worksheet was for use default profiles. If the resource does not have use default profiles, it needs to either have a custom profile applied or be a storage resource that will go into a profile optimization worksheet that we'll discuss after this. So the resource custom profile worksheet allows users to fill in custom megawatt capacities for each slice of day hour. And then there's validation check to make sure that those shown hourly capacities don't exceed the capacity listed on the LSE showing worksheet. So I didn't mention for the LSE showing worksheet, but unless using an unspecified import, the resource ID and resource sub ID should match exactly a pair from the resource database. So you can, for instance, just copy those two cells from the database into this sheet or into the LSE showing worksheet. For the custom resource profiles worksheet, you want to make sure that the resource ID and resource sub ID match exactly the LSE showing worksheet. So in the case of an unspecified import, which is actually what this example is showing, that resource doesn't match the resource database, but you do need it to match between the LSE showing and custom resource profiles worksheets. So the process for filling in a new or an additional custom profile is to copy those two cells from the LSE showing worksheet into the custom resource profile worksheet, and then fill in the megawatts for each hour. And probably as best practice, do fill in zeros when there is no shown capacity. The last worksheet in the blue group is called Optimize Storage Profiles. And this worksheet consists of a tool to allow users to fill in storage capacity where it isn't customized and where a default profile is not used, using Excel solver tools, subject to various constraints that we'll talk about a little later. So in order to fill in, or in order to list a resource, a storage resource that you want to optimize, make sure to set the default profile on the LSE worksheet to false, and do not list the worksheet, or do not list the resource in the resource custom profiles worksheet. And then once you do that, if you go into this worksheet, in order, you can click Refresh Tables. There will be a button that we'll look at in probably the next slide. And then Reset Shown Hours, and then Optimize Shown Hours. So pretty simple. Refresh Tables when you click that, it'll take a second, but it should pull in the resources that aren't listed with either default or custom profiles, which should only be storage resources, and populate the 3 tables used by the solver routine. And this is what that worksheet looks like. Up on the top left, you see those 3 buttons. So just click those 3 buttons in order. If you make adjustments or if you find that an optimized showing isn't meeting your needs, you can go back and edit the showings and then come back to this this worksheet and make sure to refresh the table again to get the updated values populated in these tables. And then reset shown hours just clears column G, sets everything to 0, and then optimize shown hours uses Excel's solver to fill in optimal values in column G. And then once solver completes and fills in those values, a query updates in the background to grab those values in column G. In some cases, this worksheet will group similar storage resources together. So the queries in the background will apply the show hour percentages to each individual resource, and then those megawatt values will show up in the LSE showing complete worksheet. And this is the how the optimization problem is set up. The show hour is the is the decision variable vector used in solver if you open up the solver dialog. The objective function is the sum of column n, which column n consists of the difference squares of the remaining megawatts and the shown megawatts. The remaining required megawatts is the requirements applied to an LSE minus the capacities shown by all resources that don't appear in this worksheet. And then the shown megawatts is the sum across each hour of all the groups of storage resources within this worksheet. There are a couple constraints applied to the solver to meet real-world needs of storage resources. So one such constraint is the state of charge constraint. This column I, serves as a proxy for the state of charge. It's an approximation of how much energy is stored in the storage resource or a group of storage resources at any given hour. It assumes that it starts at midnight with 0 charge and then recharges whenever there is no shown capacity. Another constraint is on the far right in column W, the storage maximum daily megawatt hours, which is from the resource master database, is, let's see, this is the difference between how much capacity is shown throughout the day for each group versus the storage maximum daily megawatt hours listed and summed across the group from the resource database. Okay, that's that section. Are there great
question? Okay, so the first one goes back to the initial LLC showings chart, and it's asking if you're missing the flex category. There is a flex column, so I'm not exactly sure.
Let's go back a little further. So the flex category is associated with the resources in the resource database. So the LSE complete showing or LSE showing complete worksheet will grab that value from the database and apply it to the shown flex capacity on this worksheet.
And the next question is, why are MCC buckets being tracked in this tool? They're not in what is being determined with this MCC bucket 4 tool. It relates to the recent decision, which allows storage to be shown for the compliance, not for the slice of day, for the compliance showing in 2024, rather than say bucket 1. Storage can be shown in bucket 4 if energy sufficiency for charging that storage is shown through use of this tool. So what the LSE will be indicating in column J here is which storage they are showing in bucket 4 on their compliance showing, because this will check whether there's enough additional capacity shown for charging only that storage, which is being shown in bucket 4, not other storage that's being shown in one of the other buckets. Next question is, if an LSE is showing a resource that's under construction for its year ahead showing, should it also enter this as a resource custom profile? I think that will be the way that will work best, because the resource won't be on the master resource database. It won't have a default profile yet. So it will make sense to put it in the custom profile. Next question is, when there are more than 4 storage resources, how are they grouped? And when grouped, is it possible for efficiency and or duration to be lost?
So the grouping you can see in this, the third table labeled resource or group information. You have an optimization group ID. This group ID is based on the daily storage cycle physical capability. So it just groups by that value, and then it applies the lowest storage efficiency within that group. So there is the possibility that if there's difference among the resources with the same storage capability, that some storage capacity will be lost. I don't think
we
the
can go
red
back
would
to
be
Noah.
affected.
You're unmuted, Noah.
Hey, Simone. Sorry. So I was the one who was asking the question on the flex category thing. Going back to the LSE showing tab, just sort of comparing it against today's template. There is a flex category column where LSEs would identify what category they procure the capacity at. And so simply just, I think, rather than assuming what is listed on the master data or resource data template thing, that you should potentially just create a column so that it's not taking the default value from that list. Yeah. That makes sense.
Sure, we can consider that.
Great, thanks.
I don't know if Simone or anyone wants to weigh in.
This is Jamie, Noah. I just want to better understand. Is it that you're concerned that the LSE may have contracted for a different category than the physical representation on the EFC list?
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to make sure that if a resource is category 1, but under contract as a category 2 resource, that the PUC doesn't count that particular contract as category 1, and also potentially transfer the data, sort of thinking about 2025 to the ISO, that it would be category 1. And it has
And is that,
repercussions on RAIM and so forth.
yeah, is that consistent? I'm just asking for a refresher on this. Like, is that consistent with how supply plans are submitted? So even though you might be identified as category 1 on the EFC list, category 1, category 3 on the EFC list, you could show supply plans for category 2?
Sorry, the resource is a category 3 resource, or the resource is a category 2 resource? I'm sorry.
I'm just giving an example there, but no, I think my question is that consistent with the way CAISO supply plans look at it? So do they assume the default value for flex supply? Or
No.
do they take they take the lower, or they take the category that the entity has provided, as long as it doesn't exceed the default category?
Right.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Noah.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question is, what types of resources will LSEs be allowed to submit custom profiles? And when must default profiles be used?
To my knowledge, there's only a requirement that unspecified import resources show a custom profile, or anytime there isn't a default profile available. I don't think there's any requirement apart from that any given resource be or have a default versus custom profile. Does that sound right, Simone?
I think so. I mean, in general, I would think that these profiles would not be used for resources with flat 24-hour profiles, since it wouldn't be in your interest to adjust them. So it could, for storage, that's where there's the most flexibility, and there are 3 options. You can there's a default profile for storage where it will just do a 4-hour dispatch from 5 to 9 p.m. You have the option of doing a custom profile, or you can use the optimization tool, which will shape it to the LSE load requirements. And then, there might be certain other resources like a peaker that could only run a certain number of hours a day, where you would use a custom profile to decide which hours to show it in. And then it's required for unspecified imports.
Simone, this is Jamie. Would a third-party kind of DR contract also fall into this custom resource profile bucket?
I don't think so, because based on the load impacts, there will be a specific profile for the DR provider, I believe. So that wouldn't be able to be changed necessarily. You might be able to decide, possibly, I'm not sure if you'll be able to determine which of the 4 hours out of the 5-hour availability assessment hour, or if it's set based on the load impact protocols. We'll have to get back to you on that. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so there was a question about how this will work for third-party DR, and those will have, as I just said, they'll have sort of a default profile, which it may vary from hour to hour, but it will be sort of a set shape based on the third-party provider and their load impact protocol that are approved. We have a question from Brent related to storage state of charge logic. Can a storage resource be shown in our ending?
With the current template as it's set up, well, it wouldn't be optimized to do that. So if you use the optimization routine, it won't fill in the first hour. It assumes there's no storage available or no energy available at midnight. If you fill in a custom profile, you can fill in whatever profile you want.
Cal, you're unmuted.
Yeah. Hi, this is Cal from SCE. A couple of questions. First on DR, third-party DR again. I think decision says variable for 4 hours in the assessment hours. It's a different value. I think it should go in the custom profile. Maybe that's how I was thinking for third-party DR. And tariff-based DR programs where we get allocations, I see at least in the template, default is set to 1 in 4 of the assessment hours. Is that how commission intend to do? Or would they be variable value for that too? And how to address that?
I think it will be all of these will be variables. We said it would be based on the load impact protocols. This is something we haven't fully, the DR that was in here is purely theoretical allocation, which I think was the same megawatts for each hour, but that wouldn't necessarily be the case when we do the real allocations.
Got it. But DR, for third-party DR though, I mean, it has to go in the custom profile, right? Because we provide one number on LSE showing, I believe, and it's just one value.
The third-party DR will be in the master resource database, and it will have hourly profiles based on the load impact protocols. So I don't think you'll be able to change that necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Because we'll approve a certain number of megawatts for each hour, and then I think they would be kind of divided proportionally, when it's divided into multiple resource IDs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and probably I need to look at it further. Then Simone, I'll probably get back to you. Moving on to storage, for test year, there are co-located and standalone energy storage. For the MCC4 recategorization here, again, we are assuming it's only for standalone. If we choose to show in MCC4, then I think we would indicate that resource as MCC4, and the tool would check for energy sufficiency for that particular resource, whatever being flagged as MCC4.
Yeah, that's correct. Because if it's paired storage, it can already be shown in
MCC4, so we don't need to worry about paid storage. We can show false there because we don't want to check for energy sufficiency for paid storage for test year at least.
Correct.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Okay. Can the mathematical formulation for the optimization be included in the slice of day guide?
I can put it, so we had a user's guide for the template. that we released with the template last week. I can include it in a future version of that guide, which I think is separate from the slice of day tool guide.
Well, I think we're hoping that this user guide could be combined in some way with the showing guide, but we'll see how unwieldy that gets. Okay. Is there any flexibility in how the storage resources are optimized? Will the tool allow an LSE to meet its full need in its peak hour, even if there aren't enough storage resources to meet the needs in every hour?
Meet the needs. We'll go into the optimization a little more later on, but the objective function applies the square of the difference, which should help it prioritize the maximum difference between shown and required capacities, which may or may not align with the peak capacity, but that's about all I can do.
Okay. The user guide states that unspecified imports must have custom profiles. Are there any other resource types that must have custom profiles? No. And everything else can use a default profile. And then this is a clarification from an earlier question. Is it assumed that a battery starts a day with a charge of 0 and cannot dispatch without charging first? If so, why?
That's correct for the optimization routine. There is not a validation that checks for that condition. If, for instance, storage resources applies a custom profile. And for why, it's just for the sake of having conditions, sensible conditions to start the optimization. And the assumption that most storage will be shown later in the day.
Okay, so there are 2 resources on the MRD that are not available 24/7. So do those require a custom profile? Those, correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, but I don't think those do not, because they have something like Carlsbad that is only available from 7 to 20, or 7 to 24. It's fixed, so that will be accounted for automatically. Is that right?
Let's see. It depends on what kind of resources they are.
Conventional.
Conventional. They might. At this point, they might. I could. There's no logic to applying. There's no built-in logic inside the queries to apply the available hours to default profiles right now, but we could do that in a future version of the template.
For that particular one, that's a CAM resource, though, it was going to come out of the CAM that is subtracted from the LSE requirement. But it's possible the IOU would then have to show, I guess, the custom profile. Look into that. How do you use custom profiles for energy storage if you don't want to use the optimization?
So for that, we'll go over how to input custom profile generally, but it'll be the same process for storage resources. You'll just need to copy the storage resource ID and sub ID if applicable from the LSE showing worksheet, and then fill in the custom profile in the 24 slice of day hours. And then it'll have the same validation for storage applied to it as if it were input through the optimization sheet.
Do the storage portions of co-located hybrid resources need to show charging sufficiency when listed as bucket 4? I think we already answered that question, right? So no, because that was already allowed prior to this recent decision. So it's only the standalone storage that couldn't previously be shown in bucket. I think for going back to the third-party DR, there's a question about how these profiles will work. I think we will have to have hourly profiles for the resources. So we'll have to have a similar tab to what we have for the solar and wind tabs with profiles for the DR. And then when the DRP requests to add their resources to the NQC list, they'll also be requesting to add it to the MRD. And so there'll be the one value that will go on the NQC list and then the 24 values that will go on the MRD, and they will be validated against what the commission has approved in the load impact protocol process. For projects under construction with solar and storage, how would we show battery storage optimization as a custom profile? Or would the optimization count for the best under construction? Remember, this is for the year ahead showing where their LSEs can show resources that are still under construction.
Oh, so because it's not in the resource database. So this may be one of the cases where an LSE would need to alter the resource database tab. You could simply add a row with your storage resource under construction to the resource database table, and then you'd be able to get into the optimization sheet.
Would custom profiles be needed for out-of-state wind? No, Carter. That is because we sent out the exceedance profiles for out-of-state wind after the exceedance profiles for in-state resources. So and because of that lag, they didn't get into the latest version of the master resource database, and because of that, they didn't get into this draft of the template. But no, there was a fixed template the same way as there is for in-state wind, for out-of-state wind. When an LSC enters a custom profile for storage resources, how is the state of charge valid?
So there are, let me jump ahead. There are a couple validation tests that apply to state of charge for storage resources. So there's a storage minimum state of charge. I might have misspoken earlier. This test does actually assume zero charge at the beginning of the day. And it applies the same estimation of state of charge as the optimization sheet. So it charges at a rate of the NQC times the storage efficiency from 0 at midnight until it's fully charged or until the storage resource starts discharging, providing capacity onto the grid, and then discharges at a rate of the shown capacity. And then this test just checks whether that state of charge drops below 0. So if capacity is shown at hour ending 1, it would show that it's below 0, and it would fail that validation test.
Okay, let's see. There's a question that's if DR resources have a specific profile that can be shown only in certain hours, then why would the MCC buckets remain for DR? That is because the bucket is or the DR cap is to ensure that no LSE is overly relying on command response. So just because it could only be shown in certain hours doesn't mean that an LSE couldn't purchase an extreme amount. So that's something that we haven't yet implemented in this tool, but we will need to implement that cap for the hourly amount of DR each LSE can show. Let's see, also related to DR, maybe Nora, you could raise your hand because I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. Let's see, aren't LSEs required to use default profiles for wind and solar based on default calculations of hourly exceedance? Yes, they are. Let's see. How would the user input a resource if the LSE is contracted only for the storage or the generation component of paired resource? Would it vary if the resource was hybrid versus co-located generation and storage? We've divided all the resources in the master resource database into, for hybrids, there's a sub ID for the solar and storage components, and then if they're co-located, they already have their own individual resource ID. I'm not sure if it's possible to contract for only, the solar storage of a hybrid, but if it is, I guess you would just show that portion of it. If the hybrid could not grid charge, it could be sort of odd if another LSE was showing the charging. But I guess we'd have to think about how that would work.
Just to add on to that, the hybrid deliverability test on this slide checks the showing sheet, the LSE showing sheet, and it checks the solar resource in a hybrid pair. It checks its deliverability status and shown capacity against the deliverable capacity based on the paired storage. So if that paired storage resource isn't listed, it might get a little. It might either fail this test or cause an error.
Right. For solar and storage contracts with firm energy deliveries, for example, 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., would you enter that in the custom profile? I'm not sure we'd have to think about that, but I think because we're talking about the capacity here rather than the energy delivery, I don't think you would necessarily have to do a custom profile. Anyone else have a thought on that? Does the storage excess capacity check for sufficient charging energy between cycles for multiple cycle storage resources?
It does not. It just checks the total summed excess capacities from all hours and the total storage charging required across all hours.
Yeah, going back to this last question, yeah, the energy does count towards the charging, but it's possible that most of these paired resources, the generator produces more than is necessary for one cycle of charging. So you wouldn't necessarily, if you were only dispatching it once, you might also want to show the excess solar to count towards your charging for other resources, other storage. Okay. Doug Corpa, you're unmuted.
Sort of related questions, and thanks for all the work on this. This looks like some great stuff, I have to say. If I follow correctly, and I'm likely not, by assuming that batteries start at 0 and then have to be charged from there, does that preclude the sort of the general construct of charging your batteries during the day and then discharging them overnight, including all the way through dawn the next day? And if so, like, how do we account for that or fix that problem? And just because I figure a lot of our batteries will in fact be quite charged at midnight and would be applying those to those early morning hours. Does that make sense?
Yes. So we would need to figure out some valid assumption other than 0 at midnight. And we need to build that assumption into the validation tests. I don't know, Simone, do you have any thoughts on whether and how to implement that?
Well, what is the work? Is this problem only for the optimization tool? Like if they did custom profiles, would that still pass the energy sufficiency if it on the daily basis they had enough energy?
It would pass the storage excess capacity test, but not the state of charge test.
Mm-hmm.
So we could adjust.
Is it possible to sort of set it so that rather than starting at midnight, it starts at sunset or somehow?
Yeah, we could shift the hours around so it starts assumes 0 at some other hour. We'd have to figure out what other hour would be preferred.
Yeah, we can think about this. So let us know if you have any suggestions, everyone. Chris Devon.
I'm with Tara Jen. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. I just wanted to follow up on some of this discussion on the hybrid resources. I think I understand the hybrid deliverability check here, but what I heard during the prior Q&A responses had me wanting to just flag that I believe there is a distinct possibility that some commercial contracts have been entered into where the solar is sold to a different party than the storage. And it sounded to me like that part needs some more work to be addressed in some way, if possible, if that's allowable under the current rules. But I know, before this slice a day concept was really finalized, I think there's probably some of those type of arrangements that have been entered into. So I just wanted to maybe not ask a question, but just flag that and say that I would like to try to work with the CPUC folks to try to understand that a little bit better, if there's a way that that could be reflected. And then I guess the question that came up in my mind, beyond just flagging that, is that it does seem like if that's needed, there would be some kind of interaction between different LSE showings or something along those lines. At least that was what popped into my head, and I don't think that that's intended through these through this mechanism in the template. So I don't have a good suggestion, but I'm just hoping that we could try to explore that further and somehow try to enable that to be enabled.
Hey, Chris, this is Jamie. I just want to make sure we're fully understanding the ask here. So I'm just going to rephrase what I think you said. Is it that you have hybrid resources where the capacity has been sold off to one LSE and then the energy to another LSE? And you'd like to see the framework set up in a way to capture that value for each of the LSEs, essentially kind of unbundling? Is that?
Not quite. It's where the RA from part of the hybrid from the solar was sold to one LSE, and then the RA from the storage and the hybrid resources sold to another LSE. And it sounded like that was raised as another question earlier without a potential ability to be reflected in the template. And I think there was a question of if that's even allowed under the slice a day rule. So I just wanted to try to explore that more. I'm happy to maybe have a call offline if you guys want to talk through it a little bit more, because it's complex. I wasn't really able to actually think through the question until I heard somebody else ask part of it as well. So this whole idea is a little bit difficult. It's something that we've been struggling with, how this is going to work under the showings. Just trying to think through it and haven't been able to come up with a good answer yet. So this was really the first opportunity, and when I heard that question, I wanted to try to explore it a little bit more. Does that make more sense, Jamie, in response to your question?
Yeah, I think so. So I think, and Simone, maybe you want to opine on this too, but wouldn't there be, child or sub IDs for each portion of the hybrid resource? And so to get validated kind of on a supply plan, you'd need that higher level resource ID, and each LSE would just have a portion of that total resource?
I think so. That's what it sounded like in my mind when I looked through the template when I first saw it. But I got a little bit concerned when I heard that it wouldn't validate unless they were both shown. I think that was what was stated. I'm not sure. Robert, was going back to those earlier questions? I think you mentioned that it wouldn't work if they weren't both shown by the same LSE.
That's in the current version of the template. That's true.
Yeah, so
not
trying to criticize the way that it's been set up. I just want to make sure that it gets contemplated, and then maybe we can make some kind of an adjustment for that to be reflected. If it has to be, somehow where there's a proxy for that other storage or solar component being used just to make it work in the validation, but then somehow using that like custom template piece of it to recognize that only like part of the capacity is coming from the overall hybrid for one LSE versus another. Might be. I'm just trying to think through it on the fly though. But anyhow, I think it's a big issue for us potentially. So I just wanted to flag it and try to see if we could think about it more into the future.
Thanks, Chris. We'll take it back and discuss.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Noah from Middleware Power. Couple of questions, I guess, on the charging or the storage optimization. How do you determine which resource sort of gets the first electron, or do they all get pro rata share of the surplus energy? Because I'm seeing,
For charging?
yeah, so because I'm seeing your state of charge from hour ending 1 going up, right? So if you were to reset this, or maybe if you don't, you may not need to, if you go down to Joan, something down there, right below this camp storage, it's 10, 20, 30, 40%. It almost seems like that's pretty straight line, but then it's being used slightly and so on and so forth. I'm just trying to better understand how do you allocate and what happens if there's not enough energy in the first hour to charge, and what decision-making process does the optimization go through?
So it doesn't, this version doesn't consider when excess capacity is shown. It's just making an assumption that anytime a storage resource is not showing capacity, it's either charging or already fully charged, just for the purpose of, this was really just implemented to accommodate multi-cycle storage resources to make sure that there's sufficient time between cycles for them to charge.
Okay, so
Yeah,
that means
makes
that
sense.
so that means that even if there is no additional energy in hour ending 1, but there is something in hour ending 5, the batteries in this optimization are charging at hour ending 1 regardless.
Correct.
Okay, then so I'm slightly wondering whether or not what Doug was saying about sort of asking for state of charge to be at 100% at midnight or hour ending 1, is it necessary at all? Because I mean, one, you can certainly, an LSE can use the its own non-default profile, right? Its custom profile for energy storage. But two, that if it's essentially, if there's no linkage between actual energy availability in 1 hour to charge batteries in that particular hour, then the optimization is just simply filling in the gaps.
Yeah, I think the problem that we were discussing earlier came up with the validation test, which implements a similar state of charge approximation. And if storage capacity is shown either custom or if it somehow is shown in the optimization, it would fail this validation test because this test assumes 0 charge at midnight.
Okay. I'll just mention I did break this a little bit where the hourly availability chart in the first couple of hours did not meet the demand, but the built-in validation tests were all passed. And I can take that. Yeah, I can take that offline with you. I think what just a little bit of feedback is as you sort of flip through different pages, or actually just let's focus on the profile optimization tab. It would be nice to get a acknowledgement that its process is done. And I know you mentioned there's a little bar that says, hey, I'm querying or doing power queries or whatever it is. I'm going through the process. It would be nice to say done, refresh table done, reset shown done, and then same thing with optimized shown hours done, so that the user can sort of confidently know that some process is done, because as sort of I was going through this, I didn't know when it was going to end, and it was tough to see. Oh, okay, you know, I actually got to scenario like 28, where it wouldn't solve at one point, and but just didn't know when it was going to end. And
Okay.
if it's always refresh table, reset shown hours, and then optimize shown hours in those steps 1, 2, and 3, then I would simply say just to compress it into one button. And because if you're gonna have to press 3 buttons anyways, just compress it into one button. Why not?
Yeah, we could do that. You also have the option of refreshing individual tables. So if only one of these tables would be affected by changes made on another sheet, for instance, you could refresh just the middle table and the right table, and then reset the shown hours. And the indication that it's done, if everything works well, is after clicking reset shown hours, that column G goes to all zeros. And then after optimizing, or after the solver completes, those should no longer all be zeros. But we could add a more...
Right. I understand that, but what I'm simply saying is on a UI basis, it's simpler for a user to press one button, and because it's all, if we're sort of being taught to go through all of these at the same time, or you know, consistently, then just put it into one button so that we all know that, okay, it's a one-time press, and wait, you know, X amount of minutes or so, or seconds, and you're with an acknowledgement that it's done. Great, done.
Sure.
Because I have had times where I've had 2 different or multiple answers by pressing the same button.
Could you elaborate?
Yeah, so if I'm pressing like the optimize shown hours, the solution that it solves for may be different, from the second time I'm pressing the same button, because it's going through the goal seek, and
Right.
and based on the scenario you have, you may have different results for the same portfolio.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Brent?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Yeah, so something that Noah said reminded me of some confusion that happened in the last set of workshops. Just want to confirm the kind of downtime in a energy storage resource, like the time between showing hours. There is no requirement that LSEs bring extra capacity specifically in those hours. So maybe to formulate a question, is that the case?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so formulate as a question. Is it the case that there is no requirement in kind of the current CPUC decisions on slice a day? There's no requirement that LSEs bring excess capacity specifically in the hours between energy storage showing blocks. So there's maybe a 4-hour block in the morning, a 5-hour block in the evening. There's no requirement that excess capacity is brought specifically in those hours. Excess capacity could be brought, it's just over the course of the entire day.
Simone, can you speak to that?
Well, I thought that, if the resource was being shown more than once per day, there was an expectation that there should be enough time for charging in between dispatches.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the logic for the storage, to make sure it's being shown consistent with its capabilities. But there's no requirement that an LSE's specific resource portfolio, or the showing of their resource adequacy portfolio, is meeting the exact needs of their own storage portfolio. It's really more of a kind of system-wide check. Are you bringing enough capacity to cover, at least your portion of storage? And then it's really at the system level that check is for.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
So that's really, and then I add it as a question or in the Q&A. But just want to point out the logic I built for this initially was starting at 100% state of charge and then testing the showing over multiple days to make sure that like multiple consecutive days to make sure that you weren't losing state of charge over those days, that you're at least getting back to kind of what you started at as a way to test whether it was a feasible showing over the 24 hours.
Yeah, we could do that, or we could compare hour 24 or hour ending 24 versus hour ending 1 and make sure that the state of charge at 24 is greater than or equal to 0, or hour ending 1.
Yeah, you'll get weird results there if there's a showing over hour ending 24 and hour ending 1. But yeah, I'm sure you guys can figure it out. Lower my hand.
Brent, are you suggesting to go back to the logic that you had initially used for the state of charge in the workbook?
Yeah, so I don't believe that's the only way it can be done, but I think the logic worked and it could accommodate any combination of showing hours that were valid for that particular storage resource. It might make this harder. It might make this optimization harder or nearly impossible. But I'll let you and the team think through that, because there's a lot of flexibility. The storage resources have a lot of flexibility, and that makes optimization hard. By pegging it at 0 to start, it kind of closes the envelope of the optimization, making the problem a little bit easier. Like there's probably multiple ways to get it done.
Yeah, we will put some thought into that.
Okay. Just to restate with regard to the out-of-state wind, because those profiles were developed later, they aren't yet incorporated into this tool, but they will be. We have the New Mexico, Arizona in particular that will be included. And let's go to Cal.
Hi. Question on paid energy storage or co-located. I think decision says can be charged from co-located energy only per resource based on capacity and whatnot. Is that taken into account in this tool?
We have a validation test for hybrid deliverability that I think partially accounts for that. I'm trying to think if that applies to something else also.
I thought that it capped the solar at the battery if it wasn't fully delivered.
Correct.
or at the delivery.
Energy. Oh, is this the
For the energy only solar.
is this
Energy
related
only
to
asset.
grid charging?
Whether it's grid charge or not, I think that does not probably matter. But it can charge from co-located resource, the battery. You can use that to charge the battery and then show for as if it's charged and count towards requirements without requiring any excess capacity to charge that battery. Sense.
I think the short answer is we haven't implemented that.
I thought you did implement that, you know, the
We've
cap,
implemented
it's not implemented?
the anything pertaining to deliverability is implemented. That only works for hybrid resources, not for co-located resources. And then we have a separate co-located or grouped, I call it grouped, resources that applies to both co-located and hybrid resources that just looks at the interconnection capacity. But if there are additional constraints applicable to energy-only resources, we need to discuss those.
Yeah, that would be great. And also for even standalone energy storage, the optimization, for me at least internally when we're working through, we realized at the end of the day we need excess capacity. You know, every single hour, it doesn't matter which hour it is, and you group them, you aggregate the excess capacity you're getting throughout the day. Basically long, every hour when you're long, you're collecting those megawatts and converting into energy and apply efficiency and then charge the batteries, right? And then when you charge the batteries, what you kind of rank out of them in the way you fill whenever there is a short position, you use that battery, fill it with energy, and close your short position for that hour. And you do the exercise consequently for all the hours for your shot. So it's more of a, intuitively, the solution there is about as you add more energy, you're shifting usage of your battery only when you're short, right? Not really worried about state of charge in the first hour or when to fit those usage of storage. You're just leaving up to your short position. And as you add more to your portfolio, as you get more energy, you may be long for 1 hour. Then you don't need battery for that hour, right? You just push them to short hours. And we implemented it internally. I think it seems like working very well, which we can share with you guys. And of course, it has to come with constraints. There should be a downtime, take energy efficiency into account. Also struggling with multi-day check, right? Or do we need to really worry about multi-day check here? Meaning, if I end up using battery from ironing, let's just say ironing 23, for whatever reason, do I need to worry about not showing for 5 hours continuously from ironing 23 to next day? Is that what you guys are implementing with multi-day check?
We haven't implemented multi-day check.
Okay. Yeah, but it seems like there's a little simpler way to do. Maybe we can reach out. Robert, I think we can work through. We can show what we have internally.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions at this time.
Great. Let's get back to it. So we addressed some of these validation tests. I'll just briefly go over them. We have system capacity test, along with local and flexible capacity tests. These just compare for the system capacity for every slice of day hour. It compares against the requirements with while factoring in CAM allocations, CAM and DR allocations. For local and flexible capacity, it just for each local capacity area and for each flexible category, it checks the requirements against the shown capacities. The capacity date test just looks at the contract dates from the LSE showing worksheet and compares it against the filing or the showing date in the certification sheet and makes sure that the every resource is available throughout the month. Throughout the showing month. The custom profile test just makes sure that any custom profiles are within the parameters specified in the LSE worksheet for the NQC or VER contracted. The shown hours test just makes sure, so this is where if there's, for instance, a resource that has limited hourly availability, for instance, 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. or whatever, if more hours or hours outside of that window are shown, it'll fail this test. The overwhelming majority of resources are 24-hour or have 24-hour availability. So this really only applies to those with smaller windows. The storage excess capacity test, we've discussed a little bit already, but it adds up the excess capacities beyond requirements, still accounting for allocations, and ensures that the shown storage across all storage resources, whether they are shown in a custom profile or an optimized profile, while accounting for storage efficiency losses, makes sure that there's enough excess capacity to charge those resources. The MCC bucket 4 storage excess capacity test is the same test, but it applies only for the bucket, the storage resources shown or listed as in MCC bucket 4. It's a strict subset of, subset of the storage excess capacity test. So if the storage excess capacity test passes, there is sufficient capacity to charge all of the storage resources, then there's also sufficient capacity to store or to charge only the MCC bucket 4 storage resources. The storage minimum state of charge test estimates the state of charge. As we've discussed, it assumes a 0 state of charge at midnight and then assumes any hours that for which capacity is not shown that resource will be charging until 100%. And if the charge drops below 0 due to extended usage of shown capacity, this test will fail. The storage energy test just makes sure that this really only matters for a custom profile. Actually, this might be obsolete. Didn't exceed their listed maximum energy. Oh, no. This one just makes sure that the shown capacities accumulated throughout the day don't exceed the maximum daily energy capacity of each resource. The grouped resource interconnection aggregates groups of resources, either co-located resources or hybrid resources, looks at the grouped interconnection rating and makes sure that the aggregated capacities don't exceed that interconnection capacity. Hybrid deliverability looks at the hybrid solar resource in a hybrid pair and make sure that its shown capacities are comply with its deliverability status. And then there's an overall check that just makes sure all the preceding tests pass, or if any of them don't pass, then this shows fail. All of these tests are based on queries, and each query exports to an individual sheet. Those sheets are hidden by default when you receive the workbook. You can either unhide them by right-clicking on the list of sheets at the bottom of the screen, or by clicking on the Go to Sheet button on this worksheet corresponding to the test you want to inspect. The queries behind these tests don't refresh automatically. I found that it kind of held up Excel for a bit if all of them tried refreshing at once. So users can click each one individually when they want to recheck a test. You can also click refresh all, although I've had some issues with Excel trying to refresh queries out of order. But there's a button in on the ribbon menu, refresh all, that you can also click if you don't want to click the individual buttons. If you want to review the queries, those are accessible from the Queries and Connections side panel. Double-click on any of the queries listed there, and it'll bring up the Power Query Editor, and you can either inspect the full code of a query using the advanced editor shown here, or you can click through the applied steps and see the calculations as they're applied to the table shown in the middle of the screen. Also note that you can, both in the Power Query Editor and in Excel generally, there's a little caret on the formula bar where you can expand that. Some of the cell formulas, especially, well, exclusively on the optimization sheet, are longer than one line. So it's helpful to be able to see more than one line at a time. There are 3 charts included. They are the slice of day capacity showings, which shows groups of resources color-coded with the colors associated with the groups listed on the bottom. We have battery storage, other, solar fixed, solar thermal, solar tracking, unspecified imports, and wind. We just grouped them so that the charts wouldn't behave erratically when resources were changing. But the bars are the shown capacities, and then the line on this chart with the black diamonds is the required capacity, accounting for allocations, specifically DR allocations and other CAM allocations, except for storage. The local area capacity showing chart shows each local capacity area listed on the bottom, and then for each area it shows shown capacity and required capacity. Shown capacities in bars with the same categories as before, and required capacities in the black diamonds. Very similar for the flexible capacity chart. It shows each category, shown capacities as bars and requirements as black diamonds. I just wanted to note about the Visual Basic macros used in this workbook. If there are any security issues on the computers you're using with the template regarding Visual Basic macros, if your version of Excel can't use them, all the functions that they do can be performed manually. And it's okay if you have to disable macros for the workbook. The only actions that the Visual Basic executes are refreshing the queries and setting up and executing the solver. So for the optimization workbook or the worksheet, setting up the solver will be a little bit of extra work, but apart from that, it's doing the functions manually just involves refreshing queries by selecting them in the sidebar. Now, are there any questions about that section?
Yep, there are a couple more. The first is how are CAM resources shown? If I remember right, their profiles are deducted from the LSE profiles, but the LSEs did not get the generation to use as excess for charging storage. Is that correct? So the CAM will be accounted for in two separate ways. For resources with a fixed profile, it gets deducted off of the LSE requirement. For resources with a flexible profile like storage, they can be shown flexibly. So that storage allocation, and it might be several resources depending, like if there's stored with different profiles or different in terms of cycles per day or efficiencies, they'll be listed on your LSE showing tab, and they'll be there when we distribute the template. And then we may also have to add in another similar line for the peakers that can run, say, 9 hours a day, since we don't know which 9 hours those would be, to give LSEs flexibility. So I think it should, correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, but I think it should be equivalent, that, these generators with a flat profile that are just lowering the requirement, anything else that's showing should add up the same way as if it was showing on the front end in terms of how much excess there is. Okay, you agree, thank you. All right, and then our other question is, the battery portion of a co-located resource is designated as not able to grid charge. Is there a validation to check that the battery is charged by the paired resource?
Not at this time. We're considering implementing it in a future version of the template.
Okay, why don't the IOUs have the flexibility to move CAM storage? You do have the same flexibility. Because, well, one, you'll be showing the actual resource, so you have the flexibility to show that however you want. And then you'll have a negative storage that you actually have to show for your CAM storage. It's just a little hard to picture, but we think that needs to be shown during the availability assessment hours, because logically it wouldn't make sense in terms of the way it raises and lowers your requirements for charging and other resources if you put it in hours that where you're unlikely to be showing the actual resource. But there is some flexibility in terms of when it's shown. You raise your hand if you have anything to add, Matt. Okay, I think we can go on.
Cool. So we're going to do a little demonstration to show how to navigate this workbook, this template, and also how to input a valid showing. So we have an example set of resources selected. We have some example fake requirements and allocations set up and already filled in. So this is pretty similar to what an LSE will receive from the CPUC when they get their blank showing template blank. So this is already filled in. We have the load serving entity name, noting that this text LSE_1 matches what we see here. Oops. And the date is September of next year. The showing month is September next year. The filing or the showing is, in this example, sent next June 14th. We have some information about the certification officers, I guess, from the LSE, and some information about the LSE's address. So that one's done. We can move on to the LSE showing tab, and we'll start filling this in. So notice, first off, there's already a row filled in. There's a CAM storage row. In this case, there's one row. I think LSEs may expect to see multiple rows depending on what CAM storage allotments they receive. So these would be divided up by the actual CAM resources that are allocated and the capabilities of those resources. This CAM storage ID, not the contract ID, but the resource ID and sub ID correspond to an entry in the resource database. If we go down to the bottom, you'll find these CAM resources available in the database. But this row should be filled in when LSEs receive the workbook. For the next couple resources, I'm going to just fill in an arbitrary contract ID. And then I'm going to copy a resource ID from the database. I'm just going to search for it. Oops. Make sure I have the right one. And I'm going to copy both the resource ID and the sub ID from the resource database. You may already have these values from another source, but I'm just copying them directly from the resource database because that's the most readily accessible source I have. Next, I'm going to fill in some information about the contracted capacity. So for the solar portion, I'm inputting 3 megawatts, 0 megawatts for local, is that right? Yeah, and 3 megawatts for the flex capacity. I'm just going to copy actually all of these values because I don't have an actual contract for this. And then for the MCC bucket, this will be false for the solar portion. It is not an unspecified import. You can also select these from the drop-down button. And for the solar, I am going to use the default profile. If you want to look at the default profile, that tab is here. This table is joined to the resource database through the profile category and region columns. There are a couple lookup tables if you need to be able to connect the resource database to the resource default profiles. So the profile category and the default profiles links through this resource profile categories table. So we see a resource type and a resource or a profile category column. The resource type should match a value in the resource database. This column F. And then the region is either NorCal, SoCal, or any in this case. So anything basically outside of California. And then a resource with a Path 26 designation of north in the CISO balancing authority area would map to the NorCal region. In the south with CISO, it maps to the SoCal region. Also IID balancing authority area maps to SoCal, and so on and so forth. But you can figure out which resource default profile will apply to any given resource if you need to, by looking through those. So we have those filled in. We're going to use the default profile for solar. Moving on to the storage in the hybrid pair. This has a contracted megawatts of 5.25, 0 local, and 5.25 of flex capacity. This one is in MCC bucket 4, so I'm going to select true. And it is not an unspecified import, and I'm not going to use a default profile for this one. Notice there are some little hints that pop up for each of these columns that should help you if you need more information about any of them. Although I selected default or selected false for the default profile for the storage, I want to use the profile optimization for this scenario, so I'm not going to input a custom profile. And then the queries will pass along this resource to the optimization routine here. So if I, for instance, refresh now, it should pop up here in a second. And you can see it's running in background. And we're not going to actually optimize because there's not enough shown capacity outside of storage to do much of anything. But we can see the new resource popped up both in this table and in this table. And this table should now reflect the additional solar capacity from the solar resource in the pair. So that's how you would enter a couple lines in here. Now I'm going to just copy a block of a table. For a bunch of other resources. So we have a few different types of resources in here. We have a bunch with true selected for default profiles, so these will apply the default profiles as before. This one is not true, so I think this is a battery resource, and it should pop up when we go back to the profile optimization worksheet. I think we have, well, maybe the only, these might be the only custom profiles that we're customizing in this one. So these last two are unspecified imports. So these ones were not copied from the resource database. And because they aren't in the database, there's no default profile defined for them. So we want to make sure that the default profile is set to false. And now we're going to, well, let's do it this way. We're going to copy the resource ID and sub ID from the LSE worksheet into here. And notice that when I copy in new values, or when I add, oops. When I add a new value, the table updates its size with a new row. So now if I refreshed a query that references this table, this value would show up. And in order to remove a row, I have to actually delete it like that. And now you see the formatting has changed, so it looks like just a regular range of cells in Excel, rather than the banded colored formatting in the table. Now that we have the resource ID and sub ID input, I'm going to copy in some ready-made profile here. And now if I go to, oh, okay, so now we have certification complete. Our LSE showing should be complete. And then we have our resource custom profiles complete. So all these sheets are now complete. I can move on to the profile optimization. And when I click refresh tables, notice that this column should get a lot closer to 0. And in some cases, we'll have negative values. So in this case, we have negative values. That means that there is excess capacity, basically, shown capacity in excess of the requirements. This column stays as 0 because we have 0 shown. This is basically just a summation of values in this first table. And because this first table has all zeros, there's zeros all throughout the shown megawatts here. So our objective function has a relatively high value. The solver routine will attempt to minimize that. So next I'm going to click reset shown hours. All this will do, we already have zeros here. It should fill in additional zeros throughout that column all the way down. So now our tables should be set up and ready to be optimized. If I click optimize shown hours, you should see in a second that the show hour column fills in with new values. If everything goes right. There they are. So you see this show hour is a percentage. In this case, the percentage is of the individual resources capacity, or NQC or VER under contract. So for element 7 ES1, we have NQC or VER under contract in the third table of 10 megawatts. This is pulled from the LSE showing tab. And then this is multiplied by the hourly percentages here to fill in column H, the shown megawatts. Same thing for the rest of these resources. If we had more than 4 resources, there were some questions about this earlier on, the queries will automatically group resources together. This is done just because Solver can't operate on more than, I think, 200 or approximately 200 decision variables, which means cells. So however many cells are in this column, if that exceeds something around 200, Solver won't work. In this case, we only have 4 individual resources, so they are not grouped. But when they are grouped, one additional complication is that the show hour percentages are applied to the group combined shown or group combined NQC or VER under contract rather than individual resource megawatts under contract. When this value is applied into the final showing, why is this hidden? Sorry. I'm gonna unhide the showing complete. So when we go to this tab, which is the complete showing, which shows both, it's basically the combination of the LSE showing tab and either the default profile or a custom profile or an optimized profile far over here, and also some additional fields pulled from the resource database. So when this query fills in these values for the storage, it applies the percentage back to the individual resource NQC or VER megawatts rather than the grouped. But it'll be proportional across all the resources within a group. Anyway, at this point, we have we've completed the certification, LSE showing, custom profile, and optimized profiles for a complete showing. We can move on to the validation, and actually, let's go first to the hourly availability chart. So notice that it starts, I should have gone here earlier, but it starts with just a blank chart showing the requirements. It refreshed the queries behind the chart while I was talking and filled in the shown values that we just filled in. So visually looking at this, we see there's some excess capacity in certain hours. And then where storage is shown, looks like a very small amount of storage was shown in hour ending 6, and more storage was shown between hour ending 14 to hour ending 19. We see the shown capacities just meet the requirements. At least that's how it looks visually. Similarly, on the local availability chart, this is how it looks when in a blank template. It's refreshing in the background and fills in the shown capacities. And for flex capacity is exactly the same. Query running in the background. It completes. We'll see shown capacities exceeding the requirements. So now if we go back to the validation overview, it seemed visually inspecting the charts that everything should, or at least the capacity tests should pass. But again, as I mentioned, these the queries behind these tests don't refresh automatically. So we have to click refresh individually. we're just going to see these should go from fail to pass. And the background queries are running. If we want to see a little more feedback, we can open up the side panel and see that those have completed. So those are all passed now. I'm going to refresh these three. You can see them running over there. And they were passing when it was just the storage allocation, which is as we would expect. But now that we have more resources, they still pass. Next, we want to test these three. And so they, clicking refresh, those start running in the background. And the meaning of the storage excess capacity test is basically that the sum of all of these rectangles above the diamonds across all hours should equal or exceed the value of all the storage rectangles. And it doesn't take into consideration when those excess capacities or the storage capacities are shown. Let's see, so I think we just finished the storage minimum state of charge. Those all pass. Let's refresh these last three. I might have already done this test. But we did have a hybrid pair. So this one will show not applicable if there's not a hybrid pair shown. It might also show not applicable if only one resource of a hybrid pair is shown. I haven't tested that. I'm not sure what would happen. And then similarly, I think this one would show not applicable if there aren't any grouped, not any co-located or hybrid resources shown. But we have a hybrid resource shown. I don't think we have co-located resources shown. But the hybrid resource passes the interconnection test. So we have all passing tests, and the overall test passes there. And that concludes the demonstration. If anyone has questions about this, they can send in questions now, or we can continue looking at this. If anyone has questions about, actually, let's just demonstrate going to one of the tests. So let's go to the storage excess capacity test. So all this button does is unhide this tab, which we can also do by unhiding there. It's no longer hidden, so it's not listed, but we could also unhide the check MCC4 bucket worksheet. So that's labeled or listed for row 9, the MCC bucket for storage excess capacity test. We could unhide that. And all this shows is the difference between the excess shown capacity and the required charging. If we want to look more in depth, this doesn't give a lot of information, but if we want to look more at what goes into that test, we can open up the query. And so we see the sum excess capacity minus the summed required charging. So that's the value that we see in the worksheet, 58.12. That value is greater than 0, which means that there's more excess capacity than required charging, which means the test passes. If we want to look at how those values are calculated, we can just click back through the applied steps. So in this case, we have the, let's see, let's go back to this step. So this is storage resources. We can look at the, I'm gonna make this bigger. This is listing storage resources from the source, which is this step. So this step pulls from the query LSE showing complete. And this is a subset of the LSE showing complete table that we looked at as a worksheet. It also exists as a query in here that's available to the other queries. And this test, if we go back to storage resources, took that table, excluded everything except storage resources as indicated by the presence of a storage efficiency term. This divided every shown capacity for each hour by the storage efficiency. So storage efficiency being less than 1 or between 0 and 1 increases the capacity. So more capacity, more excess capacity has to be shown to compensate for energy losses.
Hey, Robert.
Yes.
Sorry, this is Noah Tom from Middleware Power. Can we go back to your sorry, the availability check tab?
Oh yes, the chart.
Yeah. So I'm basically trying to figure out. So my assumption here is that this is the same portfolio you use to create the PowerPoint, right?
I don't know if it's the same data.
Huh. Okay. Well, then that would change my questioning, because if it is the same data, I'm just simply noticing that there's a slight difference on how the optimization used one of the batteries, potentially from hour ending 2 through 5. Or
I think,
2, 3 through
this
5.
data is the same data that was sent out with the workbook last week. The data in the PowerPoint was an earlier version with different, maybe slightly different shown resources.
Okay, got it. And then I won't ask for that question. So can you go to your LSE showing complete tab?
Yeah.
For your contract 7, which is oh good, right there. So contract 7, 5. I think what I'm seeing, and please tell me, correct me if I'm wrong here, on column F, as in Frank, I've got 20 megawatts of under contract. But then looking at the hourly distribution from hour ending 6 all the way through 19, effectively, the highest megawatt value is 8.5 or 8.43. So trying to understand what value will be sent over to the CAISO to establish the must offer obligation for the battery.
Okay, I'll take that. Okay, right. So this optimization tool, is what you noticed here, is that this LSE has basically over procured, right? So the tool, because the more the battery is dispatched, the more it needs charging. So this tool will only dispatch the battery until you're meeting your requirements, basically. But in terms of what goes to CAISO, if this, I don't know, if that resource was a 20 megawatt battery, then that 20, they're still show. I mean, if that they should still be showing that entire 20 megawatts to CAISO.
Well, at least in test year, there's no showing to the ISO. So right. I'm trying to figure out from this set of data, what is the expectation for the energy to send numeric value, which column is being sent for what, whatever resource it is, to the ISO. That would ultimately establish a must offer in potentially 2025.
That is the NQC value.
Is that column E or F? Is there two?
That is not necessarily either. I think it's like from the entry, it's easier to see it, I think, from the initial.
Yeah, this column comes from the LSE showing tab.
Okay, so this is the it will be all on this original tab, right? The notable difference is for everything, it will be the same as what's entered here, except for the solar and wind and hybrids, I suppose, because those will be combined to one. But for the solar and wind, it will be the hourly value of the peak hour of the month. So we'll have, when it gets to in terms of being the compliance year, we'll have to determine based on the load forecast for that month, what is the peak hour, and that will be the NQC value. For the others, it will be this megawatts under contract, based on the 4 hours for the storage, and based on whatever proportion of the total NQC is under contract for the other resources.
Simone, this is Jamie. There's like one little nuance in there with the zero value. So like if the variable peak value is 0, I think we adopted a de minimis value for that to accommodate CAISO systems.
Right. So if the peak hour is after sunset, then it will be 0.1 for that hour for this.
Okay. I'm going to try to break that down. Maybe going back for a second. In 2025, the NQC values, the actual NQC value list, right? That you have on the resource NQC tab, that's near the very end, which is will have monthly values. Those currently are the ELCC values. So what I'm hearing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that for 2025, these values will be replaced with a peak hour value based on the resource profiles themselves.
Correct.
Okay. Which means that if it ends up being 0.1 or de minimis, then coming to LSE showing, column D for the wind and solar resources, those people will have to put in the de minimis values and not like this contract 7, 42.
So, I mean, what we're trying to say here for D is that you should put for solar and wind, you don't put the NQC value, you put the total megawatts of the resource that you have under contract. So Pmax or half of Pmax if you only have the contract for half the resource. And then it uses that total to pull in the daily profiles based on the resource location and type. So that's like an important nuance here. That was the best we could come up with, that you have to put in the full size of the resource for solar and wind here, but not for other resources that have more of a flat profile.
Okay, got it. That's helpful because it was slightly confusing to figure out the column D specification on how you would come up with that particular value.
Right, exactly. And I don't know, we tried to come up with a way to indicate it in the column heading, but if there's a way to make it more clear, please let us. Anything else, Noah?
No, not for now.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Does a hybrid and co-located solar and BESS provide baseline capacity of NQC of the BESS for all 24 hours separate from standalone? No, they're treated, basically they're treated as if they're two separate resources. But they can, the total output cannot be greater than the interconnection. But so you're just dispatching your battery in the same way you would if it was a standalone battery at certain times of the day, depending on how many times it can cycle.
Any other questions?
Guess not.
Cool. Well, if anyone wants me to go back to the template and show how to access anything, let us know. Otherwise, I'm going to move back to the presentation for just a couple more slides on project timeline. So some things to note are that the upcoming 12 months are considered a test year for the slice of day showing. So please provide feedback on the template and the process, and we'll try to accommodate programmatic needs. There will be changes to the template design throughout the year. We'll provide documentation about each change and try to make the changes as primarily focused on usability and not break things on your end. And we may need to make adjustments to the validation, the checks as policies are decided, for instance. We're expecting to release a final template design next summer, once we've kind of hammered out any issues in the current version of the design. And then after the test year, our intention is to send out fresh templates to each LSE with their individualized requirements and allocations each month. That might even be starting this month with the current versions of the templates, as well as the resource database, which is based or derived from the resource master database. We also have a few office hours scheduled tentatively for the next 3 months in order. Right now we have one scheduled for September 21st, so in just a couple of weeks, and then one in mid-October and one in mid-November. We're accepting questions. You can submit questions for the office hours that we'll try to address during those webinars by September 18th for the first one. And that is all I have. If there are any final questions, or if anyone wants me to go back to some other part of the presentation or the demonstration, we have some time to do that now.
We have one question. What test year SOD template will be applicable throughout the year if an LSE is going to use it to show it has sufficient energy to show its storage in excess of its MCC bucket 1 cap? Will be the most recently revised version. Yes, I mean, since it's a test year and we're just rolling out, we're expecting that there will have to be changes as issues are identified as we go. So we'll be making improvements along the way, and those are what we'll send you, with your monthly template. Chris?
Hey, Chris Devon with TerraGen again. Just a quick follow-up question on the whole hybrid and co-located check, I think. Sorry for the hybrid specifically. Does that validation do an hour by hour? I don't know if I caught that earlier. Does that validation do an hour by hour check, or is that just at any point based on the showings?
Was this for the grouped resource?
Yeah, sorry.
Test?
This one, yes, the grouped resource. Yeah.
Let's see. So it checks every individual hour against the interconnection limit. And so this column represents the sum of all resources in a group, whether that's a hybrid pair or a collection of co-located resources.
Okay, got it. So so just to confirm, it's based on what the input from the LSE into the showing is on each hour.
Right.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mary?
Associates. I'm sorry, I got a little lost on the MCC bucket 4. And so exactly why is that there? I mean, is it because my understanding going in was this was just a test year. Now it seems like it is used for compliance for MCC bucket 4, or do I have that wrong? I'm sorry if I missed it earlier, but I'm a little lost on that.
Because of all the new procurement for IRP, some LSEs are at the point where they have too much storage to fit in bucket 1. So our recent decision allows storage, since this is a transition year, to slice of day where you'll be able to show more storage, assuming you have energy sufficiency. In this transition year, we're allowing LSEs to show some of that storage in bucket 4 if they can show energy sufficiency for that storage. So this column is just for the test year compliance, but it's not test year, it's for the regular compliance for this one aspect that will only be in place for 2024.
Okay, so there is some compliance that's going to be used, or this tool will be used for some compliance. It's not just a test year thing, but it's only for this MCC bucket 4 issue. I got that. Now I'm caught up there.
Right.
Okay.
So
okay, thank you.
LSEs that aren't, will only have to submit this for compliance if they're putting storage in bucket 4. Otherwise, there's only a subset of test year showings.
Okay. And then for the local, I mean, we still have central procurement for that, right? So why is that there, or is that for? I mean, I get it for San Diego, but is it only there for the CPEs or?
Yes, generally it's just just be for San Diego, or possible. So it's still in there, but it won't be relevant to most LSEs.
Okay. All right. I just want to make sure I wasn't totally lost there either. Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Noah?
Hey, it's Noah. Going back to that conversation we were having about the NQC versus megawatts contracted. I'm thinking if you would consider putting down on in the LSE showing itself the simply maybe the megawatts contracted, but then at the LSE showing complete tab that you have a column E for maybe the NQC that would translate towards the must offer obligation, and then column F to show, you know, the megawatts under contract. Because I mean, maybe the way I'm sort of reviewing this is simply like, well, which tab would you show the officer that you're complete and so on, and maybe it's the LSE showing complete tab.
Oh, you're muted, Robert.
Sorry about that. The LSE showing complete tab and this table will be what we are extracting out of the showings and compiling with all LSEs together to make sure that every resource is not overshown, for example, and every individual LSE is compliant. This column here comes from the resource database, whereas this one comes from the LSE showing tab. I'm not sure about the specific meanings of what this column is in the resource master database. Maybe Simone can talk about that.
The NQC megawatts
Yeah.
in the master resource data. That is the single value that's currently the NQC value that will be shown to CAISO. So it will be a different. It's this obviously it's still these are still 2023 values. So as we discussed before, they'll be different, particularly for solar and winds once we switch them over from the LCC values. But
I mean, if you look at this, it's you look at contract 1. There's 2 listings, right? 1 for the solar and 1 for the battery. I would ask the ISO in this case, what's the muster offer obligation for this particular resource? Is it 3 megawatts that's listed under the sun, or the 5.25? Or is it the 5.26? Or is it 8.25?
I mean, really, the NQC is that number it's just one number for the entire resource. It's not like it's double that because we will have.
I know, but I mean, you're sending. Are you sending 2 columns or 2 rows for this particular resource? And how do you do validation against? And what is the PRM?
I think
talk about that later.
To CAISO, it should only be one showing for the resource.
So I'm just going to jump in here, Simone, and clarify that I hear what Noah's saying. He wants there's something to be like a clear delineation of what is the NQC must offer kind of value for this resource on a supply plan.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we can work to provide that. I think likely CAISO would also like to see something like that.
So
Um,
no, how does it currently work for hybrids? I mean, for for solar, it's normally to a forecast. It's not, strict must offer. So how does that work for hybrids now?
Simone, was that to me or to Noah?
Well, I was asking Noah, but she thought it.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know who you were asking. So I think
Or you, whoever.
yeah. So I mean, given that it's a hybrid resource, the must offer against assuming you're the LSE contract for the entire facility, it is the 5.26 megawatt NQC. I think that because it's one resource ID, there's no for LSE ID, there's not like a breakdown of two individual components for the purposes of the.
I would guess, say, that this resource is actually a 5 megawatt battery and 0.26 solar. So there are times when it couldn't produce 5.26.
Let me see. Look. I mean, yeah. Looking at. Well, I mean, then it's the 3 megawatts has to do with the the 3 megawatts is the solar.
All right, so this is a 3 megawatt battery. So how can it meet a how does it currently meet a 5.26?
I mean, if that were the case, doesn't the hybrid NQC formula allow some 3 plus whatever's the remaining of the ELCC value on an hourly basis? So it's possible. I don't know. But I think we're going off track here. Yeah, I mean, essentially, again, going back to, it'd be great to see, to the extent that, think of a stack analysis, a page that says, here are all the RA values or NQC values, the move values maybe, to meet our sort of requirements that was shown. And I know we're not quite stacking it to peak, but just so that we can get a sense of what are the resources that are being shown and what are the RA values. Here you go, and that can translate for validation purposes, because certainly one thing we don't know about is whether or not the ISO is actually going to do modify its systems or how to accommodate for slice a day here.
Yeah, so we can try to add something that will show the numbers that will use 25th values for everything.
Yeah, that'd be great. One thing that did come up in my mind was, do you guys have a sort of a list of changes that are potentially coming up in your next iteration that that you've been thinking about? Because we've talked about sort of hourly charging limitations, requirements, and so forth, potentially grid charging limitations. What should we expect on your next iteration? That might be helpful.
At this time, we don't have a next version ready yet, but we'll be compiling a list of changes as they are decided upon.
Okay, is there a timeline? Is that, sorry, I don't have the PowerPoint in front of me, but with regards to your timeline, when do you expect to have next round of changes throughout your iterative updates?
We haven't discussed a timeline for changes. We could align it with the office hours. We could align it with months. Simone, do you have any thoughts on rolling out changes?
It would be nice, if we tried to align it with office hours, maybe. Or although the next one is coming up quickly. But hopefully we'll at least be able to have a version with the new master resource database in it. So that will have out-of-state wind and 2024 values. And then I think we'll have to get together after this, now that we've talked to all of you, and prioritize with Robert what can be done in the next week or two.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. There's one other question about whether we'll publish an analysis or findings from the test year showings. We are required to submit a report by February 1st, based on the year-ahead test year showings. That timing is so that it can feed into any spring decision in case changes need to be made in a decision ahead of the 2025 full implementation. And I think we'll be soliciting informal feedback all along the way, and but I'm not sure whether we'll publish anything else or just maybe provide some informal updates or outreach at times if need be. We'll have to see how things go.
Is there any more questions?
Past 5 o'clock. Are there any last questions before we wrap up? Okay. Well, thanks so much for all your participation. Please reach out to me, Robert, and Kelsey also, if you have any questions or feedback for us.
Cool.